Our first teacher has 25 years of experience in financial crime, law enforcement, and the North American banking environment. He's a two-time winner of the ACAMS Professional of the Year Award and was awarded the ACAMS Article of the Year Award in 2017. He's a certified Bitcoin professional, has published numerous articles on financial crime and VC-related issues and solutions, with his most recent ACAMS articles on cuckoo mining, cryptojacking, and indicators of suspicion. He's also the Chief Compliance Officer of Bitfinex. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Peter Warrack.
Thanks very much. It's a great honor to be here. I actually presented on AML at the 2016 C4 conference in Toronto, which was kind of a first in that the thorny subject of AML had not really been introduced at those types of conferences before. But I was very well received, and I'm grateful for that. As you can see, I come in peace. I figured out this is going to be the second least popular presentation during this whole conference, just because of the nature of the subject. I think the absolute least popular presentation will be Rodney and Mike Perklin's this afternoon on AML. But between the two of us, hopefully we'll do justice. As Tim Frey, who's our conference photographer, said to me last night, you know, the regs are here, we're all swimming, this is the sea in which we're swimming, so we have to kind of make the most of it. Before I tell you a little bit more about myself, we're a small enough audience here. If you have a question, comment, whatever, just raise your hand and we'll get right into it. I think we've 50 minutes. I'm going to be talking about indicators of suspicion, but more importantly, the community coming together to address a problem, I guess, regulations, in a very proactive way. I'm ex-military in the UK. Started off on the technology side, guided missile technology, then went into the dark side of intelligence, etc., which led me to the police in Northern Ireland, where I investigated everything, but including money laundering, terrorist financing, etc. That led me to North America in 2002, where I was invited to join Royal Bank of Canada to head up their proactive effort to prevent crime happening, as opposed to waiting for it to happen and then investigate it and try and recover the money. That was very successful, which led me to the Bank of Montreal, which was the last bank I worked at, and which I left in 2018, again on the criminal investigation side, anti-money laundering, terrorist financing, sanctions, etc. But more importantly, over the last 2 years of my career at the bank, on the fintech side, I got into the whole Bitcoin thing about 6 or 7 years ago. And very quickly met people like Mike Perkling, etc., who really brought me under their wing, answered all my stupid questions about how things work, and I kind of went from there. And I also realized at that time, hi Mike, I was just talking about you. I also realized at that time, in meeting people like Mike Perkling, etc., how I'd never met more ethical people in my life, certainly in the banks, as I was meeting in this new industry. Long story short, that led me to, in May of last year, I basically retired from the bank and moved into the blockchain space full time. And at the time, it was somewhat controversial in the traditional financial industry, like, oh my God, what's this guy doing? What's he doing? But it also hopefully lent a bit more credibility from the banking perspective to the space. And as well as forming my own company, which is a consulting, training, advisory service, which is just me basically, I also became the Chief Compliance Officer for Bitfinex, which, as you hopefully will know, is one of the largest trading platforms by volume in the world. And it was really interesting when I was listening to Andreas next door a few minutes ago. I was sat behind, obviously in the middle of the audience, and 3 rows in front of me was somebody on Bitfinex trading as Andreas was speaking, so that was kind of interesting to see. What I'm going to cover, again, we can go off topic if you wish, and it's going to be at a high level because we don't have much time. But what we're going to cover is very, very quickly at a high level the FATF recommendations. In case anybody doesn't know what FATF is, it's a collaboration of countries, most of the countries in the world. Sorry, I thought I'd lost the audio there. Who basically set standards as relating to money laundering, terrorist financing, etc., which they expect their member countries to follow, and the countries do follow. And if you don't follow those standards, very quickly you become an outcast in the eyes of the banks, etc., and get closed down very quickly. Last year, FATF published their recommendations, really what they renamed as virtual assets, which we know as cryptocurrencies, etc., and virtual asset service providers, VASPs, which we otherwise know generally as money service businesses, MSBs. And what that guidance basically said was, certain things have to be come into place, including registration, monitoring, reporting, etc., filing suspicious activity reports to the various regulators around the world, etc. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to very quickly set some context to what I'm actually going to be talking about, which is indicators, how we're, as an industry, are addressing that requirement. And again, although it's a standard, it really is a requirement, because if the country doesn't follow the FATF recommendations, basically, you're not going to do business there. I'm going to talk at a very high level about indicators and the categories of indicators and how they interact with each other, and next steps and questions. A big issue with FATF at the moment, everybody's talking about, is the travel rule. Is anybody not familiar with the travel rule? Okay. Presumably you're familiar with SWIFT and wires. Yeah. Essentially what FATF is saying is that the rules that apply to wires currently about the information that has to be accompany the transaction has to be applied to cryptocurrency. So in addition to the transaction itself, you have to supply certain information like name of the sender, beneficiary, things like that. And that information has to accompany the transaction. So if I'm sending, and this is between VASPs, between virtual asset service providers. So if Bitfinex as a VASP is sending a transaction to Coinbase as a VASP, as well as the transaction, say a Bitcoin transaction, you also have to supply who's sending it, who's the beneficiary, etc. It doesn't have to be attached to the transaction, i.e. it doesn't have to necessarily be as part of that blockchain entry, but it has to accompany it in some way. So that's a big challenge, obviously. Not least is how do you know if the recipient from your exchange, your VASP, is actually a VASP, and does it supply, etc. And then technology-wise, how do you actually have that communication between the two different exchanges or VASPs? So I'm not going to talk any more about that other than to say there's a lot of discussion taking place in the industry currently on that. What I can tell you is most of the major exchanges or VASPs are currently in dialogue with each other, and I'm part of that to work towards a solution. Other contributors to that conversation include analytical providers, such as chain analysis, CipherTrace, Elliptic, etc. So we are making progress on that, but that would be a separate presentation. Okay. So it's fine, FATF, which has a lot of power, makes these recommendations, I must say after consultation with the industry, and I was part of that consultation. How much of it was incorporated is another issue, but there was consultation. So this recommendation was made by FATF that certain things have to be put in place, that VAS have to be registered, they have to report, they have to monitor for suspicious transactions, etc. And what that really means is filing SARs. You have to identify suspicion, file a suspicious activity report with your relevant regulator, FinCEN in the United States, for instance. That's all well and good. Okay, we have to do that, and this all kicks in about a year's time. But as a new Chief Compliance Officer for Bitfinex, my question to myself was, okay, so what are we looking for? What is suspicion in your eyes, FATF? Or FinCEN, as you translate the FATF standards down to your own jurisdiction? And how do we do that in a consistent way? So Bitfinex, Coinbase, or whatever, how do we all get on the same page as to what is suspicious in this space? And when I'm talking about suspicion, I'm talking about as relates to money laundering, terrorist financing, and sanctions, the criminal avoidance of sanctions. But I'm also talking about, and this is a little bit outside what the core of what I'm going to be speaking about today, I'm also talking about market surveillance, trade surveillance, market manipulation, because there is a fine dividing line between manipulating the market, price of Bitcoin, for instance, and criminal activity. And the translation of that criminal activity into a proceeds of a crime, which then kicks in your money laundering reporting requirements, etc. So FATF came out with these recommendations, but there was no guidance provided as to what we should actually be looking for. And I published an article on this, I think it was earlier this year, in ACAMS magazine. The only guidance that is out there that I can find is in May of this year from FinCEN, where they published a document which included a number of red flags, which we should be alert for. And this was good, but it was not fully comprehensive, but at least something, not everything. So the bottom line is, as a VASP, in this industry and the sea in which we're having to swim, we're left to fend for ourselves and figure it out. And make no mistake, if we get it wrong, either going forward or retrospectively, we can be sanctioned, we can be fined, we can lose our licenses, etc. So there's a big gap there. One of the missing pieces, I think, of any legislation that's out there, including in Canada currently, is most countries regard an exchange, a cryptocurrency exchange, as a money service business. So in the US, for instance, you know, as a VASP, as an exchange, as a crypto exchange, if you're doing business in the US, you have to register with FinCEN, which is the regulator, as a money service business. Okay, but money service businesses, you know, relate to the traditional financial world, dollars, yen, etc., and the remittance, the transference of value funds across jurisdictions, either domestically or internationally. And that's kind of what money services businesses do. You know, they transmit money around the world. But for an exchange, for instance, such as Bitfinex, which technically I would suppose is an MSB, but in reality, its function as a business model is a trading platform. And the activity on a trading platform compared to traditional MSB activity when you're sending a remittance from here to the Philippines to your family or whatever is very, very, very different. So an obvious example of that is for those of you that come from the traditional world of banking, etc., you know, one of the long-term red flags that's been around forever that you should be alert to is rapid in-out activity. So funds rapidly moving in and out of an account for arguably no economic purpose. But for a trading account on a professional trading platform, that's normal, particularly if people are using bots and having thousands of transactions in and out of their account, if you want, in an hour, tens of thousands a day potentially. That's normal. So whilst many of the traditional red flags, and I don't like that term because they're too black and white, I prefer the term indicators, and that's what I'm going to use from now on, can be translated into the crypto world. There are other indicators that need to be developed and exist in the cryptocurrency world that we should be alert for. And I keep raising that with regulators, and we'll see where we go with that. Hopefully more guidance will come out from that, and more guidance will come from the regulators around indicators and get everybody on the same page. But we can't wait around for that. Before I go into the indicators of suspicion, how we identify suspicion in this space, you have to understand the context in which the transactions are taking place. And there's two different categories in my view. And again, this was published maybe in 2016 in ACAMS, etc. And one is the contained environment. So that's basically crypto to crypto, where it doesn't touch the fiat space. So for instance, Bitcoin is mined, it's transferred as Bitcoin to an exchange, it's transferred from another exchange to a person's wallet, moves around, etc. But is never cashed out into fiat. That's the contained environment. The other environment, obviously, is the interactive environment, where this new world of crypto interacts with the traditional world of fiat currency, cash, basically, both with the on-ramps and the off-ramps. So people use cash or cash equivalent, check, wire, etc., to purchase, say, Bitcoin. They then do whatever they want to do with the Bitcoin. Hopefully, as a professional trader, they maybe make a profit and want to cash out at some point into fiat. To do that, they're going to need either a direct or an indirect relationship with the bank. So that's the interactive environment. And we really have to understand both of those environments before you can start to recognize and build indicators that you can use to identify suspicion and file suspicious activity reports where applicable. Is anybody not familiar with the 3 stages of money laundering? Okay. So for those of you that are, I'll very quickly bore you. So essentially, the 3-stage model of money laundering. And money laundering is basically trying to hide the criminal origins of funds, making them appear clean, so that you can go and buy your house or your car and look legitimate. And there's 3 traditional stages of that: placement, layering, and integration. So quite simply, when this model was designed, it was all about cash, drug cash, right, from South America, Mexico, etc., where large amounts of cash would enter the banking system or the financial system, kind of move around, get transferred around. And that's the layering stage, the movement between accounts, etc. And at some point be integrated back into the financial system with the appearance of legitimacy. So all these hundreds of thousands of dollars in 20s that was put in somewhere into the system, bounce around the world, different accounts, etc., products, and end up at some point, another bank say, where everything looks clean, oh yeah, this came from trading or selling goods, etc., and the audit trail is obscured and the cash appears legitimate now. That's the traditional model. For those that are more progressive, we follow the four-stage model. And what that basically says is, by definition, if there's no underlying crime, there can be no money laundering. If the money's legitimate, then there's no money laundering, generally. An exception to that might be tax evasion, where you legitimately earn money, and at some point form the criminal intent to hide that from the tax man, so that legitimate cash now becomes the proceeds of a crime, the crime being tax evasion. It may be already in the system or placed into the system and then is layered and integrated, etc. So in designing indicators and trying to identify suspicion, firstly, you're looking for a predicate offense in general. And in the crypto world, these include, it's certainly not exhaustive, fraud. People defrauded. Theft. People's coins are stolen. Account takeover, also known as extraction fraud, where somebody impersonates the holder of an account on Bitcoin, for instance, on Bitfinex, for instance, and withdraws the real person's funds. Hacks, I think we all know what a hack is, where cyber criminals hack into an exchange or somebody's wallet, etc., steal their funds, divert their funds. Ransomware, obviously we're very familiar with. Many ransomware attacks are accompanied by a demand to be paid in Bitcoin, etc. Other criminal activity. So where this comes in is, that category comes in, is in the United States in particular. Most countries have sort of scenarios where you have to report suspicious money laundering, etc., where there's predicate offense. The US, as far as I'm aware, is the only jurisdiction which also requires reporting, the filings of a suspicious activity report, a SAR, for other criminal activity. What could that be? I don't know. It could be anything, check fraud or something, counterfeit checks. But there's this catch-all category in the United States. And then cuckoo mining, also known as cryptojacking, where a miner takes over the computing power of a victim's laptop, hard drive, etc., and utilizes that to mine for whatever coin they're mining surreptitiously. It's an interesting argument because I would argue if a Bitcoin is created as a mining reward, and that creation is either as a direct, in whole or in part, result of cuckoo mining, stealing somebody else's computing power, then that Bitcoin is tainted from birth. This is a new concept. How would you identify it as an exchange, for instance? I don't know, but theoretically, that would be the proceeds of the crime of whatever the crime was, stealing your hydro or whatever, and automatically be the proceeds of crime, which when moved would be money laundering and be reportable, etc. So that's why cuckoo mining is in it. Give me a second, please. So remember, I'm using the term indicator as opposed to red flag. Traditionally, in the financial space, a bank, you have a whole bunch of red flags. And in many cases, you have lowly paid and maybe poorly trained analysts looking at transactions, trying to identify a checklist of red flags. When they find 1, 2, 3, or 4, that's an automatic report to the regulator as a suspicious activity. And it doesn't require a lot of human thought. It's a checklist approach. And all, if not most banks, have moved away from that, where they actually empower analysts or investigators, they train them up, they hire them for the right skill sets to actually use their critical thinking skills to actually look at the activity in the context of the whole picture when making that determination. They don't just file on this checklist of red flags, which we now call indicators. So in my world, the presence of an indicator in most cases is not suspicious in itself and shouldn't require you to file a report to the regulator, a SAR. An exception to that might be if there's a direct connection to the darknet, where your client, your customer, say of an exchange, is receiving, say, Bitcoin into their account directly from a site that we can identify as a drug dealing site on the darknet. That might be a cause to file. And conversely, the funds are clean coming in, where they're coming from, but where they're going to is going to a site maybe on the darknet that sells pornography, child pornography, or drugs, or something like that. But as a general concept, one indicator alone shouldn't cause you to file. What you should do is there should be several indicators, multiple indicators, and more importantly, you should consider these indicators in context. And that context starts with the understanding of the customer and what you would expect to see with their activity. One of the useful ways of looking at this, and also if you're involved in either the delivery of training within your organizations, or I know like Amber and Rodney here, a company that actually provides training services. One of the ways you can do that in a consistent way and getting your analysts and your investigators to investigate transactions in context is to follow what we call the 360 model. And this is a model that was created in, I'm not even sure when it was created, maybe 2008, 2009, when I was at RBC, and which the Royal Bank of Canada follows, Bank of Montreal follow, others follow around the world, as training to their investigation teams, to their analysts, and how to conduct an investigation in a consistent way and get to, hopefully, to a consistent decision, that decision being it's suspicious or it's not, we have to file, we don't have to file. The second consideration being, do we retain the customer relationship, or do we exit the relationship? And I'm not going to go through every single step in detail on this model. It is available online. Just type in ACAMS and the numbers 360, and it will bring you to the whole article. I can tell you it works, but the bottom line is, the important thing about this is, before you can understand the transaction, say a Bitcoin transaction, you have to understand the person that's conducting it, typically your customer. Because without that, how can you make sense of it? Many years ago, when I was at a bank and I was brought into that bank to turn the AML side of things upside down and kind of make it work a bit better, we delivered a lot of training, and I had people running up to me all excited with a bank statement, list of transactions, cash, wires, whatever, all excited, like this is really suspicious, there's all this cash, all these wires in and out, etc. My first question would be, well, what does the customer do? What do we know about the customer? Oh, I haven't looked at that yet. Well, this could be perfectly normal for that category of customer, you know, and it could be expected. So that's the model. So understand the customer, then and the expected activity, what you expect to see, then what are you actually seeing? Eliminate the normal, get rid of the noise, so you know, the hydro payments, the mortgage payments, etc. And then concentrate on what's left. And at that point, bring in indicators of suspicion and what we call the anti-money laundering AML thinking map that accompanies this and is in the article, which basically stimulates your thought process. It's not a checklist, but have you thought about this, have you thought about that type of thing. Before you make that final decision, it's suspicious, it's not suspicious, etc. So I can't recommend that highly enough, particularly if you have teams of investigators, whether you're in a bank, a VASP, etc. And it's free, it's on the internet. So, bottom line is, the landscape is changing. We have no choice. And you know, the whole concept, the whole philosophy of Bitcoin and its creation in the wake of the financial crisis is something I subscribe strongly to. Having said that, we are where we are now. We're in the real world, and we have these regulations coming in around the world, driven by FATF, etc. And if we want to stay in business as an exchange, as a VASP, we have to comply. Otherwise, we'll be out of business. The knock-on effect of regulations, I don't know, in that will it drive activity peer-to-peer, outside exchanges, outside VASPs? And if you're not a VASP, you're not required to report, follow the FATF standards, etc. So you have that whole, it's not a black market because the vast majority of P2P activity currently and going forward will be legitimate, people who value their privacy for good reasons, etc. But you will also have those bad actors. What it's going to look like, I don't know. The point is we have no choice. We're in this sea, we're swimming in this ocean, and so we have to comply. So hopefully, Rodney, for your presentation this afternoon, I've softened the blow a little bit and you're not going to get assassinated on the way out. So, we knew this was coming, right? We knew these regs or these recommendations were coming from FATF. So back in 2018, I got together with a few folks originally. It's now become much bigger. And we said, okay, this is coming. How can we get ahead of the game? How can we own our own future? How can we shape our own destiny? How can we show the regulators that we're legitimate, we're robust, we're ethical, and we mean business, and comply with the regulations, etc. And what I'm talking about specifically is regarding what constitutes suspicion that has to be reported under the new recommendations. So the indicators of suspicion. So what we decided was, firstly, it doesn't say this on the slide, I don't think. Firstly, we decided as stakeholders, and I'll go to the stakeholders list in a second. One, there should be no competition where it comes down to best practice to identify bad actor suspicion and report it. There should be no competition between my exchange, your software tool, your software tool. We should all be on that same page of knowledge, and where the competitive advantage comes for a software provider, for instance, is how you actually apply that knowledge in your tool and how you visualize it or whatever. But the actual knowledge itself should be, everybody should be on the same page as at the same time. And this is all drawn from a project in Canada, Project Protect, started in 2015, and human trafficking, which was and still is extremely successful, where everybody came together, banks, law enforcement, regulators, to address the issue of human trafficking using indicators and shared knowledge. So this is modeled on that, and it works. So not one of us, not one exchange, one VASP knows it all. So, you know, you're an exchange, you see your activity on your exchange, you know yourself, this is suspicious, that's not suspicious. You might see activity that I might not be aware of on my exchange, and we share that knowledge. So it's collective knowledge. And through that collective knowledge and the generation and the application of indicators of suspicion, we can really help law enforcement do their job through the regulators that take in our reports and give them real and meaningful suspicious activity reports that identify what's normal, why we consider this suspicious, etc. And let law enforcement do its job. That knowledge comes together, obviously, from a VASP's and exchange's experience, the experience of its analysts and its investigators, SAR regression. So every month, for instance, in Bitfinex, every month we dissect every suspicious activity report we filed, and identify the indicators within that in a particular SAR. And you're talking about hundreds of SARs here. The indicators that caused us to be suspicious. And you know, we have highly trained investigators. We don't have low-paid, no disrespect to analysts, but low-paid analysts. We have highly trained people. And this is why this conference is so important, actually. And one of my investigators is here, actually. Not in the room. Well, but training is a huge piece of this. Anyway, on a dynamic basis, we always keep each other on the same page, and we compile these indicators and share them, and then how we apply them is up to us. So this was conceived in 2018. It was informally launched at Europol EC3, that's the cryptocurrency working group between law enforcement and private sector, in June this year. The UN ODC this month in Singapore. The Blockchain Alliance, which is quite a large association with a lot of law enforcement members, exchanges, etc., from primarily the US, but also around the world. And now here, informally launching it here. And in about a week, it will be formally launched. The first report will be published, which is pretty comprehensive. This is the final draft. I'll pass it around so you can have a quick flick through, and then please give it back to me at the end. It will be accompanied by a press release. It will only be available to trusted parties. So firstly, it will be shared with FATF, with Egmont, with FinCEN, with FinTrack, CRA, IRS, Europol, Interpol, our contacts in law enforcement, etc., software providers such as Chain Analysis, Elliptic, Blockchain Intelligence Group, etc. But it will also be available to other trusted parties. And at the end, I'll show you how you can get a copy of it if you're a trusted party. And hopefully you'll take it, use it, and also contribute back. So if you're in the business where you're seeing suspicion and we haven't identified that, then please let us know. So again, you have to throw this around fairly quickly, but thanks, Em. So I'm looking forward to that publication. It is pretty comprehensive. Europol commented actually that it was the most comprehensive report that they've on this subject of indicators that they'd ever seen. I'm actually presenting this at Interpol. I got asked yesterday in Singapore in December, and hopefully FATF will take it on board as well. So it's an example of the industry being proactive, being ahead of the game, realizing we're swimming in the same sea, and owning our own destiny, hopefully. So the purpose of these indicators, obviously, is to identify suspicion, file suspicious activity reports. But to do that, we have to be able to utilize those indicators in a way that, across hundreds of thousands of transactions, millions of transactions, depending on the size of your exchange, etc. So that requires automation. These indicators inform the design of transaction monitoring systems, and also training. The training of your investigators, your analysts, if you're a regulator, your staff that are receiving all these reports, so that you understand what they mean. And this has to go beyond simple connections to the dark web. So currently, the transaction monitoring solutions that are available to a cryptocurrency exchange, a VASP, such as, again, I'm not endorsing anybody, they're all good. Chain Analysis, Elliptic, CipherTrace, Blockchain Intelligence Group. I'm sure I've missed some of the providers out there. But all of them share a common theme. They're one-dimensional. They say there's a direct connection or indirect connection to something not good, generally the dark web or the darknet, or an account that's been used for ransomware, or a hack, proceeds of a hack, etc. And that's all they show you. They don't know anything about your customer. They're just looking at a transaction. It could be a legitimate customer, for instance, a law enforcement account that is doing test purchases on the darknet. And they're all different. All these solutions are different, and again, they're all good, but they're one-dimensional. And as a VASP, when using indicators to design transaction monitoring, and also in training, you have to go beyond that direct connection. Also, the software solutions that exist don't cover all coins. They cover some, the usual suspects, Bitcoin, Litecoin, etc., but they don't cover them all. They also don't address generally other factors like volume and velocity of transactions. So what you need, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. You need something bigger than that. And law enforcement, who are the users of the ultimate product out of all this, need to be trained as well as to what these indicators mean and why they're important or not important, etc. I hate reinventing the wheel. It drives me insane that FATF have formed a working group on indicators of suspicion. FinTrack, no disrespect, in fact, I have a lot of respect for FinTrack. The Canadian FIU has a working group on indicators of suspicion. Egmont Group, which is the financial intelligence units around the world, they have a working group. Guys, girls, just take this report. That's a great starting point, right? Rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. And again, the main thing is being on the same page at the same time. So, where are we? Again, this is a very, very informal relationship. I wouldn't even call it a partnership as such. It's a coalition. People who jump on the calls, people who edit the documents, the information that we're collating, people that support this, people that can take the output of it and apply it to their design of their software solutions. Or, as we have them here, Outlier Canada in their training solutions. It's a pretty impressive lineup. It doesn't include everybody, or anybody. We don't just want anybody. But, Binance, big blockchain intelligence group, the Blockchain Alliance, which is huge. Are you waving at me, or do you have a question?
I have a question.
This is Amber from Outlier.
If there are folks in exchanges in the room that wanted to become involved and participate, how would they do that?
Okay, so the question is, if you want to become involved, how do you do that? I'll tell you about that. I'll tell you in a second. If you've got $100,000, don't buy Bitcoin. But Blockchain Alliance, which is huge association itself, ACAMS, which is huge, the Anti-Money Laundering Association, Chainalysis, Cybertrace, Bitfinex, Elliptic, BlockGeeks, which is another training company, a bank, Scotiabank, one of the biggest banks in Canada. Great. More banks. Let's have more banks. Remember that interactive environment? These indicators, they affect banks, the fiat on-off ramps, etc. Plus other trusted individual contributors, people who really know their shit, basically. So the categories that we're talking about here at a high level, it's not just a direct connection to the darknet. When we're designing, or when we're trying to identify indicators and use those indicators and shape them into typologies, we need to be able to categorize them in some way, and these are some of the categories. So the user information, the documentation they provide, how they behave, what product do they use. And for those of you that are in the know, you'll see that some of this stuff is derived from the 4 pillars model of AML risk management, the US BSA, Bank Secrecy Act, expectation, product, service, geography, etc. Organizational structure, movement and velocity of funds, how much and how quick and all that kind of stuff, and where to and where from. PEPs, politically exposed people, persons. Is the user a government official, for instance? Could they be corrupt? Could they be using Bitcoin, for instance, or crypto to steal funds or move funds derived from corruption? I'm not sure if there's a laser on this. I don't want to blind myself. So. As you can see on the right, it's not just as simple when you're taking these indicators and designing a solution, a transaction monitoring solution. There are many facets to this, and each are weighted differently and interact with each other differently. It's about the user, their transactions, the context in which everything is taking place, and these other blobs are all these other bullet points on the left-hand side. Most banking systems, transaction monitoring systems, are two-dimensional. You'd be surprised, volume of velocity. The user's moving more than $25,000 a day, or they're moving $5,000 more than 6 times a day, or whatever the design is. And not taking into account customer behavior, customer risk scoring, that the customer's a PEP or in high-risk occupation, things like that. There are many other factors. In addition, as I mentioned at the start, as you get more sophisticated, and this is an increasing regulatory expectation in the crypto space, you have to factor in market manipulation, trade surveillance, that there's not wash trading going on. The user's not creating multiple accounts under different names and basically moving the funds between themselves to give the appearance of trading, etc., and which increases price, etc. So in designing a solution, it's not just as simple as buying a software solution. The solution has to be at that end, which is the front end. But again, these solutions only cover a limited number of tokens, coins. You have to have something on the back end within your exchange that looks at thresholds and other factors, customer behavior, customer risk scoring, etc., in building an effective solution. Okay, I think I'm doing okay for time. I'm not going to go through every single one of these. These are just an example of some of the typologies that fall out of these indicators. So a typology, I define it as a cluster of behaviors and actions based on the indicators that you identify. So you have a bunch of different indicators. You put them together in the form of a logic, an application, an algorithm, and apply it to transaction monitoring to generate alerts that this behavior is characteristic of potential money laundering because all these indicators apply in these weighted ways. Again, I'm going to go through this very, very quickly. These are just examples. I think the slides will be available if you want them. These are all drawn from the document that's being passed around, but it's just a snapshot. I mean, there's hundreds of indicators. And this is just kind of what they look like, so I'm not going to even dwell on it. I'm just going to skip to the end in the interest of time. Bitcoin ATMs. Again, Bitcoin ATMs, some of them also provide other currencies as well, Litecoin, etc. Some allow you to buy Bitcoin using cash. Some allow you to sell Bitcoin and get cash. Some require quite good KYC. Others mostly don't require any KYC. So it's an indicator. Yeah. So very quickly, firstly, thank you for your time. Hopefully you'll realize, although regulation is a cough syrup type message to swallow, it's important because none of us will be in business if we don't apply the regulations. Hopefully we can work as an industry and own our own destiny and inform the regulators and have that partnership with the regulators in moving it forward. To answer Amber's question, how do you get involved? That's who you contact. I'll leave that slide up there for 15, 20 seconds. So all the members of this group, it's agnostic. It's not owned by Outlier. It's not owned by Bitfinex or whatever. It's agnostic. Again, there's no competition around shared best practice. So we do have a website. There's nothing on it at the moment, but the email does work. The report, probably next week when it's published, will be on that website, but you have to be a member to access the website. And to become a member, you basically use that email address, say who you are, why you want to become a member. Hopefully you'd like to participate. Generally criteria, you're a registered exchange, you're a legitimate software company in this space, you're, hopefully everybody here is legitimate, a person of good character in the industry, that kind of thing. The last thing we want is bad actors. You're law enforcement, you're a regulator, that type of thing. We just don't want it out there generally, because then the bad guys and girls will kind of know what we're at, type of thing. And that's my email if anybody needs anything. If you have a Bitfinex account, you've got a problem, please don't send me. Use our customer service. I do my best, but so thank you. Unless anybody has any questions, appreciate it. Thanks. Any question? Anyone want to become a member? Yeah.
Yeah, I just had a question about the VASPs, or that process of how does it address the stable coins, like a Tether or would that be applied the same way as it was a fiat transaction? Would that,
Okay, so your question was how does
so
the VASP that,
yeah, let's say you have two exchanges, Bitfinex and Binance, and it's transferring funds between
Yeah.
the two in the background.
yeah,
Whether they use, let's say they use stable coins instead of
yeah,
actual transactions, you would have to have the same VASP type of
yeah, so,
things applied to those transactions.
yeah, Bitfinex and Tether are, and will both be under the new legislation VASPs, and will actually need to exchange information between each other.
So
in a way that-
Gemini in New York, for example.
Yeah, Bitfinex and Gemini, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, thanks very much. Thanks.